I'm very pleased to welcome Jon Davies, who will be talking about Colin Campbell, his video art and writing. And just a few words of introduction about Jon. He, where are we here? He's doing a PhD. He's a PhD candidate in art history at Stanford University. In fact, he's researching the intertwining of artistic and sexual experimentation in San Francisco. He's worked as a curator with the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery, Oakville Galleries, and the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. His writings have been published in Canadian Art, in Fillip, Frieze, and Master Drawings. And he has just published a book called More Voiceover, Colin Campbell Writings, which, if you're interested, you are invited to get 20% off the book. If you go to the Nichols website, the codes and the access code to order a copy of this beautiful book at checkout, all the codes are there and you'll get 20% off. So Jon Davies is a curator and a writer and an art historian, a student. I'm going to let him explain Colin Campbell, of course. He's going to talk about his experiences producing his anthology, More Voiceover, and curating 2 exhibitions that surround Campbell's work in video. And I thank you all for joining us. And Jon, I will turn it over to you. I'm a little rusty, folks. I haven't done this in a while.
Great, thank you very much.
Share, and you're welcome to share, Jon, if you have slides.
Can you see my?
Yes, that's great.
So I just wanted to thank Michelle and everyone at Nickel Galleries for inviting me to be here today. I'm speaking to you from Oakland, California, which is unceded Ohlone land. And Colin Campbell was a pioneering Canadian video artist who first picked up a camera in the early 1970s when the medium was still in its infancy. And he made dozens of tapes over 30 years until he passed away from cancer in 2001. And I won't have time today to get into all the different tapes and approaches and themes that he worked on over those years, but I'll talk about a few of them. Colin was born in the very small town of Reston, Manitoba in 1942. And he started medical school and then kind of quickly figured out it wasn't really for him. And he was kind of at a loss and decided to do a personality test to tell him what he should do with his life. And the first response to the test was that he should be a doctor. So he moved on to the second suggestion, which was to be an artist. And he didn't even really know what that was. He was a reader growing up, but there wasn't much art in Reston, Manitoba. And he did as he was told, and he decided to study art first at the University of Manitoba, where he got his BFA, and then he ventured to Southern California to get his MFA from the Claremont Graduate School in 1969. And his early work was very conceptual and kind of focused on the body. You could think of artists like Dennis Oppenheim and Vito Acconci as being touchstones for him. But he was also very interested in the voice and in performance and creating personas through very simple things like a particular tone of voice or rhythm of speaking or gesture or way of carrying himself. And these personas ended up being really central to his work and kind of a way of fusing performance for video with narrative and storytelling. So first was a figure named Art Starr, who we see in the still from his early 1970s tape called Sackville, I'm Yours, made when he was teaching at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick. And in this tape, he plays a man named Art Starr, who is also an art star, being interviewed about what it is like to be a famous artist in Sackville, New Brunswick. And so it's this very playful, ironic tape about the experience of being an artist in a small town, basically. And then the persona he developed after that was the woman from Malibu, who I'll be talking about more. And then Robin, who he crafted, and again, this is him performing all of these personas. Robin was a photocopy girl who worked, I believe at CIBC Wood Gundy in Toronto. And Colin kind of came up with her when he was working in an office as well. And she starts a band and becomes kind of a scenester in Toronto, which is where Colin was based for most of his career. And then we have another persona named Anna, who is based on a real bisexual Belgian art critic who he had met in his travels, and he plays Anna in his, what I think is his masterpiece called Dangling by Their Mouths. So Campbell used video as a flexible and accessible medium for storytelling. His work is about characters and their words, tall tales, rumors, conversations, and daydreams. And a lot of it was kind of pulled from his everyday life. Ironic, irreverent, and ambiguous, always attuned to the playful shifting of genders and desires, his tapes chart how the self is performed and circulated in the social world like gossip. And the characters and personas he created and those of his collaborators kind of confide secrets and stories and craft compelling mythologies about themselves. So these personas were a way to fuse performance with narrative, with storytelling. So by taking on these fictional figures, he was able to meld real life experiences and fiction and to explore aspects of his identity. And he'd always been very androgynous and as well as bisexual. And he had been married to the video artist Lisa Steele, and you see the two of them here. And they went to Los Angeles together for 8 months in 1976 and 1977, funded by Canada Council grants. It was a very prolific and kind of key period for both of them, a time of exploration and kind of change in their video art practices. And I had the opportunity to curate an exhibition that's currently touring that zooms in specifically on these two bodies of work that they made separately, but living in the same home studio in Venice Beach in California. So that time away from Toronto really unlocked something in Colin Campbell, and he devoted himself to making a 6-part series focused on this persona he crafted, whom he called the woman from Malibu. And she's an older middle-class white woman, somewhat anxious about the modern world and what she's seeing around her in Southern California. And she became a filter or lens for thinking about this strange landscape of 1970s LA. So thinking about the desert, thinking about Hollywood and celebrity culture, thinking about the violence of that part of the world, murders and kidnappings, UFO sightings, alien abductions, tabloid headlines, things like that. And Lisa Steele told me that they really saw themselves as kind of anthropologists in this new strange culture. And Campbell told his friend, the curator, Peggy Gale, quote, "A lot of things I and the people I know do seem as much to me like fiction as real life. It's entirely possible to see one's entire life in the third person," unquote. So this is kind of the third person that he came up with to kind of make sense of or process his time in California. So I'm going to show a clip from the final tape in the Woman from Malibu series called Hollywood and Vine from 1977, where Campbell begins his monologue in the process of becoming the Woman from Malibu. But you'll notice his voice actually stays the same. So there's kind of a continuity between him, him as him, and then him as the Woman from Malibu. So the clip is on Vimeo, and so I'm going to put the link in the chat, and then we will just go our separate ways for 8 minutes and 15 seconds. So just click on the link, watch the video through Vimeo, and then I'll start talking again when it's finished. And the sound, there's no sound for about the first 30 seconds. So if you're worried that something's wrong, the sound should come on after 30 seconds. So I'm going to mute myself now. As you can see, the Woman from Malibu has a very precise way of speaking, and Campbell kind of discovered her in a newspaper article where a woman had witnessed her husband fall off a mountain, and she remembered very clearly kind of the altitude of where she was, where her husband was, where other hikers were, and it seemed like kind of fixating on these details was a way of kind of dealing with a trauma or with things that were bigger, kind of harder to deal with emotionally. So that was kind of the thinking behind this persona. And Campbell said that kind of detailed observation seemed like a perfect way for her to talk about the culture that I was now both immersed in and observing. She became the vehicle for expressing all the eccentricities of Southern California. To me, it seemed like an interesting way to comment, as opposed to the artist saying, here is what this looks like. It was more fun to use her eye because she went places where artists would never go and did things artists would never do, like the Rose Bowl parade or going to the RV show. I imagined things that she would do, and then I went out and did them. He also said, I've probably never written any male characters. I find them really hard to do because I don't know what men are supposed to be doing. I've never been very good at doing what men are supposed to be doing. It seems also I don't have a great deal of confidence about knowing what men are thinking about. I feel more comfortable writing characters that don't have to be definitively a woman or a man. I think that's because all women and men share a common voice at many points, unquote. And if we're thinking of the late 1970s, this is really quite radical at the time. I think to have this kind of fluid, malleable sense of both kind of gender identifications as well as attachment or orientation. If we think of what was happening like more broadly politically at the time, in terms of like gay liberation and lesbian liberation, those tended to be very separate. And then in feminism, there was a lot of there was a kind of war against pornography, and there was this return of this idea that male sexuality was one thing and female sexuality was completely different, and and their desires just would not line up. So this was kind of the backdrop against which he was elaborating this much more kind of fluid understanding of both gender and sexual orientation. So taking on this female persona for the first time in California, and it's not what we usually think of as drag, I would say. There isn't really an element of caricature or to it. To me, it feels very organic. It becomes a way for him to think about gender identity and power dynamics, think about sexuality in a new way, both on like a personal level and politically, so micro and macro levels. So words and speech, wit, different voices, narratives, and social positions are all really key to his work and laying the groundwork for what we would later call, I would say, queer performance. And Campbell was really an expert of the monologue. And that was kind of a driving engine for the videos that I selected to include in the book. Campbell was very enthusiastic about writing dialogue, but more often he approached a tape more as kind of different monologues that were juxtaposed in tension with one another, rather than a conversation. And so the monologue format, I think, really allows one to enter into a character persona in really great depth. And it creates a really strong sense of intimacy between the speaker and the listener, or in this case, the speaker and the reader, I guess. So the Woman from Malibu series is where Campbell first started scripting his videotapes instead of improvising or pulling from found texts. And before he went to California, he was incorporating a lot of personal letters and kind of diaristic texts. So this was really something different to be using fiction this way. And this was kind of the birth of him as a committed writer. And this commitment only grew over the next 25 years, where he started writing multi-character storylines and experimenting with fragmented narratives, conflicting stories, until he essentially left video making for several years in order to write two novels, which were never published, but which I was able to include substantial excerpts of in the book. And it almost seemed like in the 1980s, he really needed writing more than maybe we could say the video or the visual to kind of grapple with everything going on in the 80s. So as the rise of conservatism, the Reagan, Mulroney, Thatcher years, he experienced it as a decade where there was a lot of male violence or kind of like threat or menace in society in the 80s. There also AIDS in the 80s. And he told Peggy Gale, the curator, in 1982, his friend, quote, "Video is still one of the mediums that allows the enormous freedom to do anything you want. But I think it's also time to convey really specific, serious ideas about what you feel about living. And the only way to do that is to write it." So the book that I edited focuses on Colin Campbell as a writer and tries to think through the relationship between video and writing, narrative, and storytelling. The way the history of video is narrated is often through a formalist lens. So what are the specific qualities of this form, this electronic signal that until relatively recently was captured on magnetic tape for playback? And artists working in video are often careful to distinguish their art from television, which David Anton called video's frightful parent. So to distinguish oneself from television, you avoided narrative, you avoided characterization, you avoided anything that resembled entertainment or could resemble entertainment rather than art. So it's kind of a anxiety around, is video more a low culture form or a high culture form? But through Campbell, I was interested in thinking about an alternative history of video art where we don't anxiously disavow its relationship to television as well as to film and theater, but instead think of how video is actually an ideal medium for kind of containing other elements and for capturing talk and speech, performance, characters, storytelling, and doing so not only or not necessarily in a way that's narcissistic, where there's this image of like the artist speaking into the camera and they're relating to their own image. That is part of video, but I think when we think about personas, performance, storytelling, it really opens video up onto the world and bigger ideas and politics, and gets beyond just the individual artist. So the camera almost seems to want someone to talk to it. And for a while now, I've also been interested in gossip and how gossip is something that coheres and holds together communities, in this case, artist scenes in cities like Toronto, where Campbell was based, and at the center of a very vibrant media arts community and circle of friends and collaborators who appear in his tapes. So I'm interested in gossip because it's unofficial, it's not based on facts, but it's very revealing about the desires of the speakers and the people who share it. So I feel like these kind of myths and stories that are told by communities are just as revealing as the actual facts of who did what and when. So I think of video as a place where artists can talk to and about each other and work through some of the social dynamics of their communities. And so Campbell's personas kind of became participants in his community as well. And he often talked about them as if they were real people. So he would say, oh, Robin did this, or, Robin's in Mexico right now, or, the woman from Malibu did that, or this is what she's up to now, as if they have agency themselves or certain power over him. And once he said he's always trying to avoid closure, quote, I just wanted my characters to go on, unquote. So I'm just quickly going to talk about the book, which ended up being about 400 pages. And I just want to thank Jeffrey Little, who's here, of Concordia University Press, for approaching me to put together this book 3 years ago for their text context series of writings by Canadian artists. And the first book in the series, collecting Ken Lum's writing, came out last year. So I'm just going to go through the book pretty quickly and then talk about a few salient themes that are present in the videos, which I was already familiar with, but which really came alive in the writing and thinking of him as a writer and putting together the book. So I've been researching, curating, and writing about Campbell's work for about a decade. By the time I was invited to do this, and this started when I was living in Toronto and was invited to curate a retrospective of his work that toured the country between 2008 and 2012. So the book project quickly took shape, and in addition to transcribing many of his 50 or so video tapes and performances, I also gathered artist statements, artist talks, short fiction, critical articles, often about video art in the world and politics around it, also about artist-run culture. Also gathered ephemera, a really important interview he did with curator Sue Dida that was primarily about his writing, reproduced an artist book and a couple of other text-based pieces that he did for different publications in the 1980s. And then choosing two meaty excerpts of his unpublished novels, one called The Lizard's Bite and one called Disappearance. So it's our table of contents. I wrote a pretty long introduction talking about this kind of constellation of Colin Campbell, and then kind of what a history of video art that's kind of centers writing, what the potential of that could be under this idea of there is no fiction. So on the left, we have an artist statement by Campbell. I can never think of endings. Conclusions don't interest me. They don't exist. Moments interest me. Short periods of time where one's senses are finely tuned. It may take 30 minutes of tape to investigate a 2-minute event. Things happen very fast, simultaneously occurring sounds and images, which may or may not be a literal interpretation of one another, are part of my work. I never try to distinguish between acting and not acting. They are the same to me. And on the right, we have a letter that he wrote to the art critic John Bentley Mays from Toronto, from Venice, California, to John Bentley Mays in Toronto. That is essentially a critique, strongly worded critique of an article that Mays had written about video art, where he essentially dismisses it as a juvenile medium. And so numerous artists like Colin and Lisa Steele and Clive Robertson responded to Mays's article. And this wasn't published. This was sent to Peggy Gale and found in her papers at the AGO. That's actually Peggy Gale in the upper left corner here, and Lisa Steele below her. And then Colin is here as well. This is one of about half a dozen tapes that Campbell had withdrawn from circulation over the course of his lifetime, which his estate allowed me access to transcribe. So his work is all in distribution with V-Tape, distributor in Toronto, which he was a co-founder of. Yeah, very excited to include work that was very important to his development, but which at some point he decided he didn't want circulating as videos anymore. So this is one of them. So Modern Love was an artist's book based on his video Modern Love, where he premiered the persona of Robin. And with Art Metropole in Toronto, he did an artist's book version in a series that others like Lisa Steele and General Idea participated in as well. And on the right is a artist's project, like a publication version of a tape called No Voiceover, which inspired the title of the book. The biggest kind of archival find was probably this talk about a video that he gave at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he actually delivered it on the election night when Reagan was elected in November 1980. So he was surprised anyone had showed up to the talk, because everyone was at home watching the election. So this hadn't been transcribed before. It just existed as an audio file in the MoMA archives. And what's interesting is he talks about this narrow vision of video where you only focus on it as like a fine art form, as being limiting basically to its audiences. So he's asking why shouldn't we be interested in the television audience and the film audience and the theater audience? Like, shouldn't we want as big an audience as possible? And then on the right is one of his many articles about artist-run culture and kind of politics of arts and art funding in Canada. So it was really rewarding to put kind of all the pieces of the puzzle together. I came to see writing as a glue, holding together everything he did, something very important to him. It was also putting together the book was kind of a way of connecting with a generation of artists, critics, and curators who shaped video art and how was talked about in Canada in its early decades. And Campbell was a very beloved teacher for many years at University of Toronto and at OCAD, Ontario College of Art and Design. And his influence is very widely felt. So I was always kind of negotiating this experience of not having ever met him or known him, but also feeling very attached to him. And this tends to play out where with this uncertainty of calling him Campbell versus calling him Colin. And also, very intimate experience of going through like personal letters and things like that is kind of an emotionally weighty thing to do. So one big discovery is finding this early short text called Stories of Reston. And I'll just read the last story, called Suicide. Died suddenly was how the Reston recorder put it. It was a hot July day. Roy went into the barn and found him hanging by a rope. He had stood on a bale of hay and kicked it over. He was 14 years old. No one ever talked about that too much. He was Reston's first suicide. No one ever mentioned the fact that he had been wearing his mother's clothes. So Campbell was really kind of haunted by this figure, this 14-year-old, over the course of his life. So I see this teenager wearing his mother's clothes and committing suicide as kind of a proto-queer or proto-trans young person. And I think for Campbell, the story was kind of an example of what it's like to be different in a small town, basically, and that this could have been him if he didn't get out and kind of make his own life for himself outside of the small town. And so decades later, this teenager, like this figure, shows up again in his novel, The Lizard's Bite. So that was quite amazing to see how much this like story from his youth kind of stuck with him through his life. Another kind of key moment that I found really moving was Campbell's experience of the AIDS pandemic. So he went with his then partner, John Grayson, who's a filmmaker and activist, to the World Conference on AIDS in Montreal in 1989. And they listened to women with AIDS talk about their lives and the stigma that they faced. And this really impacted Campbell. And he made this 60-millimeter film called Skin, kind of a docudrama where he restaged those voices of women with AIDS. And he also made another short tape kind of, kind of related to AIDS called White Money. But I think Grayson is like a kind of seasoned activist, and Campbell was very involved in fighting against censorship and fighting for artists. But I think he really was trying to figure out like AIDS impacted him so viscerally that he knew that he had to do something more. And so, sorry, let me find my place here. So rereading his short story Noise, which was published in 1991 for the book, it's very dark, and clearly he's in a huge amount of pain, thinking about his friends, a student named Ross, and others who were dying of AIDS. And he was working on these kind of care teams, helping physically take care of sick friends. And he's kind of figuring out like what the artist can do in all of this. And, he always had a very strong sense of justice and sensitivity to the workings of power and the abuse of power. And the AIDS activist group ACT UP had this famous slogan, "Silence equals death." And Noise is kind of his pledge to speak out and to kind of do more as an artist to fight AIDS. And so it ends by him telling himself, time to make some noise, Colin. So I thought that was really kind of beautiful moment of like self understanding, or kind of reckoning with what was going on around him and what the artist could do. And the last thing I'll say, I know we're running out of time, sorry about that, is I wrote an essay a while back about how in several of Campbell's videos, you find out later in the video or at the very end that the narrator who's speaking to you is actually dead. So in tapes like Culver City Limits and Conundrum Clinique, you realize the narrators are recounting their own murders, for example. And Campbell became, I would say, obsessed with reincarnation and the idea that people continue to speak, and thinking about how lives resonate after they're gone. And it's hard not to imagine that as a response to the toll of AIDS. But his two novels are both about historians becoming intimately involved with the subjects of their research. So The Lizard's Bite is about a Caravaggio scholar who kind of connects with someone who had found Caravaggio's diaries. And then the novel called Disappearance is about a medievalist who's studying the Cathars, an order of monks, and essentially connecting with them across time. So the novels cross time and blur the living and the dead, basically. And then when Campbell returned to making videos in his last years of life, he expanded on these ideas. So he didn't know that he was going to pass away, but the tapes he made in the late 90s until he passed away essentially kind of closed a circle of his earlier work through the lens of a new persona named Colina. And he revisits his earlier personas and gives us new details about them, makes new connections, kind of checks in with them years later. And it almost feels like a kind of setting his affairs in order. And so it almost feels like he kind of pushed his writing as far as he could with the novels. And then when he turned again to video, it was more to kind of revisit old friends and think about them in a different way and kind of extend their stories rather than try to create something completely from scratch. So thank you for listening. I know that was a lot of material and some of it a bit heavy, but yeah, I really, I guess I've been like inhabiting or like living with or alongside this work for going on like, I don't know, 14 years now or something. So it's, yeah, thank you for listening. And I think we probably have time for some questions.
That was so interesting, Jon. Thank you so much. And what a labor of love. It sounds like you've been through so many archives and viewed so many videotapes, and it's fascinating stuff. Folks, we do have a few minutes for questions, and thank you for the kudos that are coming in. But if you have a question, please just put it in the chat. But maybe I can start off, because something that you said about gossip really intrigued me. How, as a historian, as an art historian, how would you go about researching gossip? Like, why shouldn't you? Of course, but how would you do it?
I think that I think my answer to that would be often video artworks are like contain or like trace the gossip. And that was actually my first idea for a PhD dissertation, was to look at artist communities like Toronto, Vancouver, and then I was thinking San Francisco and Los Angeles, and kind of trying to reconstruct these like social and sexual dynamics behind the scenes through how artists were using video as a way of talking, basically talking to each other, talking about the scene. And Fillip Monk, the curator, has written a lot about that with Colin Campbell's work in Toronto, and specifically the tape Bad Girls, which was about a club called the Cabana Room that was also where the tapes were shown, like as a almost like a TV series. They were shown in installments, and they evolved based on the response from the audience. So yeah, I think, I mean, especially the last year and a half, where archive, like traditional dusty paper archives, have been hard to find. It's been interesting to think of like where else those stories can be found, and where other traces can be. And yeah, maybe that's the future project. It's like, yeah, video as gossip, basically.
For someone that works in a museum that is part of a library and an archive, it really begs some interesting questions about what we save and the things that slip through the cracks. So yeah, interesting. Again, we have just a couple of minutes for questions, and if nobody volunteers, I'll just keep Jon talking. And I was really, well, another point of interest is, and you sort of mentioned this, is who was really the audience, A, for the novels, and why didn't they get published, and B, the videos. Were these really messages to the community that Colin saw himself being part of?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think his videos circulated quite widely and internationally and went to biennials and things like that. But I feel like, I arrived in Toronto from Montreal in 2002, and I feel like it's so hard to imagine watching them without knowing all of the people who are in them, and what it would be like to go in kind of as a blank slate to watching them, because I feel like they do resonate so much with his friends and community, and the specific kind of local, provincial, and national kind of events of the day. So yeah, there was both a local and a national and international audience, probably each of those getting their own pleasure from the work. And then sorry, I'm forgetting the second part of your question.
The novels. Why weren't
Oh
they?
yeah, that's a very good question. I really love the novels. Again, it's hard for me to separate them out from loving his videos and everything about, him and his voice and all of that. So it's hard for me to be objective about them. I think one thing is they tend to be kind of pulpy. Like there's kind of a boy's own adventure, like kind of maybe like Nancy Drew, like Hardy Boys kind of aspect to them, which is like really enjoyable, but maybe was I don't know, maybe that was seen as like not high literature or something. I'm just kind of guessing. But he took them very seriously and spent a lot of time on them, did many drafts, shared them with friends, really wanted them to see the light of day. And so it was, I tried to be, it's very tough to exert something that you feel like should be seen in its entirety, basically. So I really hope that somebody who reads it will decide that they can publish them, basically. And so I tried to just kind of have them be almost like teasers that try to capture something of like the essence of his voice, or the connections with all the other work and other things in his life, like that story of that boy in Reston. So I tried to foreground those rather than try to capture like every detail of the plots, because there's a lot of twists and turns in the book. So yeah, it was kind of, maybe, yeah, teaser is the best way of describing it, and then hopefully somebody will publish them, and they're you know, available through like his estate, and
Right.
yeah. So.
Interesting. There is a question about if you have any ideas about his influence or the influences his work might have had on other artists.
Yeah, he was had so many students over the years, and a lot of them, you know, were really kind of shaped by him. And I think it's not only the work, but also just, he was just a very kind of ethical, engaged kind of person. Like, he just had a vision of the artists and what they could do in the world. And I think that really um, kind of influenced students as much as him, his own work, or being a really interesting and engaging personality. Actually, over the years, there have been several artists who've made kind of homage artworks to Campbell, and the one that's popping first to mind is Benny Nimer made a piece, I believe it's called something like I Am Colin, or Colin Is My Real Name, I think. And then V-Tape actually commissioned artists to do work in response to Campbell's work. So I would say there's at least maybe 10 artworks in circulation that are explicitly grappling with his work and his influence, and a lot of those were by his students. And I think, yeah, for me, I guess specifically, I have an interest in queer and sexual representation, and so it just really seems to be like anticipating kind of aesthetics or dynamics of that I think of as queer, but like long before that was really a word that was used for like a whole field of activity. So it just feels very prophetic, and I'm always drawn to like the material. It's more about like the slippage or the uncertainties of identity rather than the stability of it, I guess. So it just feels very like laying the groundwork for a lot of what would come later, and doing it in just like a kind of mischievous and subtle way. Like he's not announcing that he's like rethinking all of these paradigms. He's just kind of doing it with Lisa there, or John Grayson, and yeah, I just find it really moving.
Fascinating. I think we need a Colin Campbell today. What a pleasure, Jon. It's obviously it sounds like an amazing project, a great book, and you're deep in the process of your PhD. And we wish you all the best luck with that. It's been such a pleasure to be introduced to the work of Colin Campbell and your research. Speaking personally, as someone who sort of lived through the 70s, wow, the technology has changed so much. But I could feel the graininess of the video, and like it just, something about that just takes you right back. The tone and the pacing, and yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah,
So
I tried to, I know we're wrapping up, but I tried to write about that a little bit in the introduction, is how analog video feels like more and more fragile over time. And so I feel like that's
well, it is.
well, yeah, it literally is. And then,
decomposing.
yeah. And then, but it's like a way of thinking about it in a similar way to speech or newsprint, or like these almost like, more ephemeral forms of communication. You really feel it when it seems like the image is barely holding on to the tape. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for all your good work, and thank you for joining us here today. I'm sorry that it's 1:05 already, folks. Thanks everyone for coming out and supporting. Lots of kudos and thanks coming in.